Good evening. Before I start, I really want to thank our business office so much for the work that has transpired since April 1st-ish, when we found out what was actually in the governor's state budget to now. So Leanne, thank you and your staff, and Darrin, thank you for all your hard work with us. When the state budget was adopted, a couple things happened. One, it balanced our base budget, which is really good news. It also lowered our tax cap levy, which is another piece of good news. And it provided incentives to the remaining 5 school districts across New York State to move to full-day kindergarten. Specific to full-day kindergarten, this meant for Pittsford a total of $1.3 million over the next 3 years. Additionally, we received a $200,000 Senate grant to also help offset the cost of full-day kindergarten. These incentives were because of our advocacy, and I can't thank all of you enough who are involved with so many letters that you wrote and phone calls that you made, and visits to Albany and visits to our local legislators. These incentives would not have happened without your support. In order to implement full-day kindergarten this late in the budget season, so if you recall all the way leading up to before we left for break, our focus was on the base budget. Because it's later in the season now, we plan to use approximately $1.3 million from fund balance in order to incorporate full-day kindergarten. We were able to make this a consideration because of underspending our current budget and also by having a long history of prudent use of our reserves. I'll be asking the board tonight to approve a budget with full-day K built in, as I believe the time is right for a couple of reasons. One, never has a district ever had an incentive like this, ever. Next year, or the following year, anything could happen in the governor's budget. The bill could be removed or altered, or full-day K could be mandated in 2 years, offering no additional funds. So because of the funds that we're getting and because of the concern of what the future may bring, I think it is prudent for us to make sure we're implementing this year, or at minimum that it's in our budget. Full-day kindergarten operating costs are just over 1% of our total budget. I think that's a key point. Without question, we can close a 1% gap without eliminating programs or opportunities for students. Our fiscal health is strong, as evidenced by our reserves and the comments our reserves received from the comptroller. Our bond rating and our multiple audits all talk about our fiscal strength. Parents and students in grades 1 through 12 do not have to be concerned about eliminating opportunities like APs or eliminating electives because of full-day kindergarten. We will identify this 1% of efficiencies over the next year and do so in a collaborative way in order to reduce the reliance of year-end funds or fund balance. Of note, and this is of significant note, and this will probably be the next call to action for anyone that would come on board, is that we're still receiving mixed answers about the weighting of our full-day kindergarten students. So as we transition from half-day to full-day K, right now we've heard yes, they will count as full-day K, and we've heard no, they will not count as full-day K. If the answer is yes, now we are looking at one half of 1% of a gap to close. Tonight's budget should actually elicit a sense of excitement, as a successful budget vote will yield a true K-12 experience for our district, just like over 99% of the rest of the state. You have seen the benefits of full-day kindergarten and all the research that's been presented over the last 4 years. Simply put, it's best for students, and we can implement it and sustain it without cutting programs and with staying under the tax cap. Last week I spoke with the superintendent, and I spoke again with him today, who recently converted to full-day kindergarten. Actually, they converted 2 years ago. Since then, they have seen an 18% increase in academic achievement. They are seeing their kids involved in more play. They're seeing less stress and anxiety in grades 1 and 2. And my favorite quote, as the superintendent went to the first grade teachers and observed and talked with them over the course of the year, what they reported, and I guess this is their mantra now, is more reading and less crying in first grade. So if we truly want what's best for students, paying attention to our youngest learners is paramount. And so you're going to see full-day kindergarten within our budget presentation tonight. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to actually ask for official board action to approve our total spending plan. And what tonight entails really is taking the work from my office and transferring it over to the Board of Education to make a budget that's been ongoing to now be in your hands and make it the Board of Education's budget. As we looked to this year's budget, and as typical, we always turn to our budget guidelines. And I'm not going to read through every bullet, but you can see during this process, we continue to focus on developing a student-based budget, which means we're focusing on engaging in authentic experiences for our students. It means that we're focusing on the whole child, and it means that we're hiring and retaining employees of the highest quality. We also understand the importance and belief in the importance of high-quality professional development that's focused on our strategic initiative, our vision work, our curriculum and assessment, and our social emotional learning. We believe strongly in continuous improvement for our instructional and non-instructional staff. We also believe in balancing the investment in education with sensitivity to the community with limited resources by seeking new sources of revenue. So when I think about new sources of revenue, I think about how close we are relative to our smart bonds work and garnering an additional $1.5 million. I think about the $300,000+ we received from the credit union. I think about the $1.3 million from the state and the $200,000 from Senator Funke's office. And also looking at the community's expectations for service and programs with changing property values. And I think that full-day kindergarten is also one of those things that are going to help us keep competitive, be one of the best in the games, and also potentially impact property values in a good way. Maintaining fiscal stability now into the future through financially prudent and sustainable reserve accounts. You've heard me talk about the comptroller's reports, our audit reports. We're seeing from all different people that look at our business inside and out, third-party people. You're seeing people that go into other districts and actually and write public comment about their use of reserves, either using too much or using too little. In our comments, and our most recent comment from our comptroller, is that we have a very reasonable approach to our reserves. And of course, we have to meet legal mandates and contractual obligations. So tonight, I'm going to take us back to March 12th to start. And as we started this process on March 12th, what we were considering was a budget that did not have anything more in it and did not have anything less in it. We were looking at a base budget or a rollover type of budget. Since March 12th work session, our base budget has been balanced, and we are recommending the addition of full-day kindergarten. And you're going to see the appropriation side of it, the aid package, the levy, and the use of fund balance. So last month, as a quick read, on the appropriation side, we were plus 0.269%, and on the revenue side, we were at 2.27%, leaving a deficit of $733,000. Understanding that we made a commitment to not override the property tax cap in any way, shape, or form. The state budget then came in, and albeit as typical, it doesn't just come in and you can make all of your decisions and answers at that point. It kind of trickles in. And then when the state budget is finished, when it trickles in, you're doing your own running of state aid formulas, you're checking the math, and then you're trying to understand what is meant by certain aspects within the budget. But we did receive foundation increase to 1.9%, which is $147,000 additional dollars. I will just make a little note that you'll see later that 1.9% still is among the lowest we could have received. The district was successful in getting New York State database updated to include the latest capital project submittals, which was huge, allowing building aid to increase an additional $237,000, nearly covering the entire debt service, which was promised last year. It also reduced our property tax cap to 2.64%. Some of the things that we were concerned about that were in the governor's budget were proposed caps on aides. That did not come through. We were very concerned about the extended school year services for our students with special needs, which would have been about $400,000. That did not come through. And our total operating aids, excluding the building aid part, decreased $190,000. So in sum and substance, there were certain things that were, if they were in the governor's budget, probably would have been non-starters for us to get to this point. So it was kind of like the perfect scenario where a lot of the things that we were concerned about were removed from the budget, and in addition, we had the conversion aid, and then we had the Senate grant.
Looking at what we call the base budget, much of this is similar to what you saw last time. However, there's a few changes since then, mostly having to do with the state budget. If you look at the undistributed down towards the bottom in the peach-colored section, that decreased by almost $400,000 because of the extended school year. You recall the governor was trying to transfer those costs from the state back to the local school districts. The legislature did not support that. We were able to find some other efficiencies throughout the budget, but you can see where the breakdowns are in the major functional areas for the budget. So the base budget was a 2.37% increase, down from 2.69, what you saw the last time. Moving on to the revenues picture. At the top of it is the state aid, foundation aid formula, $169,000 increase overall. Last time we were together, we were looking at slightly over $22,000. We were getting the minimum cap or minimum floor, I should say, of 0.25%. The legislature, or the enacted budget, increased that to 1.9%. Various aids are up and down as we go through. BOCES aid, that decrease is a function of what we expect to spend as of the end of this year. There's certain things that are happening that we're not going to spend as much on. For example, technology or the smart bonds is delayed, so we're not going to be able to make that purchase for this year, so that drives our aid down. Those are what's called the expense-driven aids. Last time we were together, we talked about urban, suburban. That's strictly due to enrollment. Enrollment is down slightly, so the aid comes down a little bit. So overall, $188,000 reduction in our operating aids. The building aid, as Mike mentioned, the state pumped in another $237,000 compared to the last time we were here. They finally caught up with the final cost reports that we submitted in early October. They updated their database. If you recall, any building aid is an exclusion in the tax cap. So our tax cap lowered from 2.9% down to 2.64% increase. So about $2.6 million. So the budget, the base budget was in balance.
So the addendum to the proposed base budget, so going from there, we have a balanced base budget. We looked at this year being the year of opportunity for full-day kindergarten, and that is because of the multiple year of conversion aid primarily. And I understand that it's confusing when you see what's on the media and what that means, and you'll see the actual numbers in a second. The first year we have a full formula allocation, so when it was reported that full-day K is being paid 100%, it's 100% of the conversion rate. And then over the next 2 years, that lump sum declines. So we have 3 total years of support for full-day kindergarten. And the caveat was that this aid is only accessible for school districts that convert either this year or next year. The challenge in the budget I alluded to before was that weighting of students and increased enrollment and the connection between the two. So what we did not see in the budget or receive any confirmation of is how those students are going to be weighted. Again, if they are weighted full-time, then that is an additional annual amount of approximately $800,000 for us every year, year after year. A challenge for us, an additional challenge is projected enrollment and sectioning and staffing, and you've seen multiple enrollment projections. Jeff and our CIO and our data team has done a tremendous job projecting enrollment, but it's difficult when we're talking about projecting 5-year-olds, students that have not been connected to our district before. But we believe we have a really good range of students that we feel are coming to us and to what buildings they're coming to us in. When we did this, we calculated the very high end. And so what we calculated ultimately, and I think it's prudent, is if every single student that's kindergarten eligible went to Pittsford, this would be the end amount. Understanding that when the year starts and enrollment comes in, if we have less sections needed, then the fund balance will go down. If we have all the students that came to us, the fund balance would stay the same. I think that's an important part. So as we talk about $1.3 million of fund balance, that's the ceiling. That's the highest it could possibly be. And we also have a plan with an eye towards the future. Again, I want to reiterate to the board that we're talking about approximately 1% of our budget is allocated to full-day kindergarten, and in order to reduce our reliance on future use of fund balance, then we will be seeking 1% in efficiencies to avoid tapping into that. So as we get into the conversion aid specifically, and looking at year one, the previous law would allow for conversion aid in 1 year, which is $731,000, and the enacted budget, it's $649,150, and that could be $731, it could be $800. It's forecasted based on enrollment projections. In year two, we would see approximately $421,000, and in year three, $227,000, for a total of $1.298 million. And again, I want to go back and reiterate, if there is that weighting, and if there's not, then I think we have our next advocacy item, because that's a significant part of adding value to our budget, to reduce our reliance on reserves. So as we look at disaggregating the specific cost of full-day kindergarten, our salaries and benefits area, we're looking at about $1.7 million. And again, this is 18 sections of teachers and paraprofessionals. We may not need 18 sections, we may need 14 sections. So I would say our realistic range is between 14 and 18. We have 5 bus drivers that's actually funded by discontinuing midday kindergarten bus runs, so there's not a cost there. That first part, that staffing part, is the reoccurrent cost. So when I talk about that 1% of our budget and finding efficiencies, that's where that lies. Equipment is paid for through the Senate grant, equaling about $223,000, and then we have contractual and miscellaneous at about $12,000, and then supplies and materials for 18 sections at $262,000. Again, that number will go down if the sections go down. And as far as capital costs, we have to purchase 5 buses, and we're doing some work with parking extensions at Allen Creek and Park Road. This is fully funded by the bus purchase and capital reserve. So this is nothing new. This is stuff that we will purchase and we'll get aided on, and we'll continue just like we do with our normal buses. The other thing I would like to thank is to acknowledge is the work with the town in looking at some of these capital costs, to work side by side with us to reduce some of those costs associated. So total year one implementation costs are about $3.4 million, less the support funding, which would be $650,000 from conversion aid, $200,000 from the Senate grant, and then $1.185 million from fund balance. I'm sorry, from reserves. And then the appropriated fund balance is that part that will offset the operating costs for this first year, and that is at $1.37 million. And again, that may be lower as students enroll. Another way to look at the costs for full-day kindergarten, how much it will cost, you'll see 18% on buses, 50% on teaching and support, 7% on equipment, 8% on supplies, and 17% on capital infrastructure. And as you look to the right side, where's the financial support coming from? About 20% is coming from conversion aid, 6% from Senate aid, capital reserve, 18% for buses, 17% from capital reserve for facility improvements, and it has 0% support from the levy. So really, New York State is funding about 25% of our first year full-day kindergarten costs, and the district fund balance and reserves are the reserve account is funding about 75% with no impact, again, on the levy.
The first two columns are what you saw under the base budget. The reddish-orange colored column is the full-day K, and it's basically pulling together what Mike just went through. In the schools, that's where the salaries are budgeted, supplies, materials, equipment, etc. Down in the undistributed towards the bottom, that's the buses, the capital costs, as well as the benefits for the people that are working up above. So you can see that we went from the $133,140,000 base budget, added in $3.4 million to come to the $136,544,880. So up from a 2.37% takes us to 4.98%. Budget to budget. Moving on to the revenue side, the aid stays the same with the exception of what you see in the red column, $649,000 for the conversion aid, the year one conversion aid. We are being conservative right now and going strictly with what the legislature provided to us in the state aid runs. However, if we get the enrollment projections that we anticipate, that number will be closer to $800,000, and then that will also be about $300,000 worth of help, $150,000 worth of additional help in years 2 and 3. But to be conservative, we're staying with the state aid runs. $200,000 from the Senate/Dormitory Authority of New York State grant. That's very specific on the types of capital items we have to expend. That's why we needed to be careful with how we listed out equipment and what we were going to purchase. So $849,000 worth of state aid to help fund that program. We have the reserve funds, which Mike spoke of, and then the $1.37 million. So even after all that, as you can see, the tax levy increase is exactly the same as it was the last time I was up here at 2.64%. Just a pie chart to show the current year without full day K and the proposed budget with full day K. And the only real difference is the tax levy actually becomes a smaller piece of the pie, if you will, from 75% to 74%, and that's because we're using a little bit more fund balance and reserves to help offset the additional costs. From a fast facts or a summary standpoint, maybe some things that you might want to remember. The property tax cap reduced from a 2.9% increase to 2.64% increase over the current year's tax levy. That levy, as we just talked about, will not change with the implementation of full day K. We have one-time startup costs for full day K, and they're being supported by a little over $800,000 in either conversion aid or the one-time Senate bullet grant. We are withdrawing money from our reserves, and that's just like having a savings account that you might have at home for a leaky roof or whatever. These are monies that are set aside for specific purposes such as this, buying of buses and capital projects. $1.85 million. And then our recurrent costs. We're going to fund the recurrent costs with the portion that the conversion aid doesn't cover, $1.37 million. We've worked very hard to try to contain the tax levy growth. We heard the community say that they did not want to override the tax cap. We also did a lot of work looking at other school districts in our area. You saw this chart before. This is all the school districts in Monroe County, or basically Monroe 1 and Monroe 2 BOCES. And we measure up pretty favorably since the tax cap. It's not surprising to see, and you're going to see some charts that prove this point in a few minutes, districts to our west that are lower wealth and very dependent on state aid, they can manage their tax levy and their tax cap a little bit easier. Same kind of chart looking at just the east side, and we're actually below the average line, and that's pretty impressive considering that we've had 2 years of implementing the debt service on a pretty expensive capital project and still stayed within line. This next chart just tries to give you an idea as far as the buckets of where our support for our budget comes from. And in our district, compared to most districts, the tax levy is a pretty high number. Most districts are in that 50–60% range. We're about 75–78%. So the left-hand chart shows that in dollar amounts. The state aid down here looks like it's increasing by quite a bit. However, in the last few years, the building aid has been the big generator of that. Our use of fund balance reserves has been slowly increasing, a bit more of an increase for this year because of the full day K. And what I call miscellaneous other than that would be things like interest revenue on your investments, et cetera. That's been declining, but as rates are starting to go up, as we've talked about in the treasurer's reports, we've been able to tick that up a little bit. Looking at it from a percentage standpoint, in recent years, the tax levy has been less of a player in supporting our budget. We've been trying to find other ways to support our budget growth. The building aid and the state aid has helped with that, as well as the use of the fund balance. So this chart just goes to show that the bars are what we actually receive. So the blue bars are our tax levy, what it has done over since the tax cap time frame, as well as the state aid, the actual state aid received compared to what we legally are supposed to get. So bottom line, the takeaway from here is if we were getting the state aid that we're supposed to legally get for 2018-19, and the projected enrollment for full day K students was being aided at that actual enrollment, we would get a little over $5 million more in state aid. And right now the state owes us $76 million since the inception. So I know some people may say that's crying over spilled milk, but the way I look at it, especially since I filed my taxes this weekend, I would like to see them come back where they're supposed to go. A quick look at how the aid was distributed. You saw a chart similar to this back on February 12th when the governor came out with his budget, and you saw the red line kind of spike way down for us. We were the only school district at 0.25%. That was the minimum at that time. Most of these other districts during that time were in the 1.2 to 1.4% range. Because the state budget now says you get a minimum of 1.9%, they got moved up to the 1.9, so they're in a similar playing field as we are. This is part of the reason, though, why we feel as though we will not get the aid on the students that come to the district or the full weighting, because the whole formula here was based on a percentage of what you got last year. It's not based on enrollment. Some of these schools have declining enrollment, and you don't see their aid going down. So if you look at aid on a per pupil basis, their aid per pupil went up some pretty hefty percentages, where ours is right around 0. This shows a bit of our demographics, if you will, and it's not all that surprising, but what it does is it takes the increase that each school district got in foundation aid and says how much help was that to controlling their tax levy. And you can see for us, only about 0.2% of the help for our tax levy compared to the District A all the way to the left. What they received in additional funding for foundation aid had an impact of about 2.2%, or pretty close to what their tax cap was. Again, that's no great surprise. However, it became more apparent to me when one of those districts called me up on Friday and said, you know, I'm looking at this stuff, and it seems like the state is trying to take the wealthier and high-performing districts and bring them down to our level as far as performance, and doing it through a funding mechanism. They could see the writing on the wall. Shifting gears from the budget, similar to what we've done for many years, there's a bus purchase reserve or bus proposition. It's a separate proposition from the budget. We're requesting from the voters to stay with our replacement schedule for our buses as per board policy of 10 years or 100,000 miles, and all of these buses are. We're asking to replace 12 buses at a cost of over $1.3 million, less trade-in allowance, so that's the maximum amount. We're estimating that will generate about $820,000 in aid on those buses that we use to replenish the reserve as we receive it over the 10 years. And I just wanted one thing to make clear for tonight that's a little different this year, is this is not tied to the buses that you heard about with full day K. That's in the general fund budget. We thought it made sense to keep those costs all together so that we didn't potentially get into a scenario where the full day K passed, but this didn't, and we couldn't get the buses to make it work. So keep all the like cost centers together. This will not have a tax levy increase. You'll see some schools out there that are doing a separate proposition, and they're asking to levy additional taxes to buy buses. That's not the case here. We're just asking the voters for permission to withdraw money from the savings account. This is the language that you will see in the voting booth. And this list has gotten pretty short compared to a few weeks ago. We have the public hearing on May 7th, and then the actual budget vote on May 15th, which will be at the Barker Road Middle School Gymnasium.
I want to go back to the beginning and reiterate the fact that tonight, from my lens, and I think from many of our lenses, is an exciting night where we now have full-day kindergarten within reach, which is something that is extraordinary for our students and for our community. The other part that I'd like for you to remember is that visual of the graph that shows where we stand relative to our tax levy increases compared to the other school districts in the county. I think that's important. Our community pays a lot of taxes, but I think that the misnomer that may be out there too is that our increases are annually substantially higher than everyone else's, and that's certainly not the case. You saw that we are in the middle of the pack with the cap in Monroe 1 and 2, and we're very close to the lowest in Monroe 1.
So may I have a motion to approve the 2018-19 proposed budget and adopt the budget? Any further comments, questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried.
Thank you.